It always feels surreal to me nowadays when I'm actually excited for something to come out, and when it releases, it actually meets my expectations, and in the case of Requiem, even exceeds them in a few ways. Right off the bat, I'm gonna say it, this is the second best one of the new crop of Resident Evil games that have come out, starting with Resident Evil 7. It's not as consistently good of an experience as the remake of 4 is, which I think is kind of a given. When you have two protagonists who are going for very different gameplay styles, you're unnaturally going to get one who's executed better or one you're going to prefer over the other. And when they intersect the way Grace and Leon's campaigns do in Requiem, some of the stuff hits like a bulldozer, while some stuff could have been better in my opinion. Although the character who actually turned out to have some of the weaker parts was actually Leon this time around. But I'm going to get to that when I talk about the rest of the video. This is not going to be like a traditional review. I'm going to be mostly just kind of rambling about whatever comes up in my head about the game in terms of characterization, story, or gameplay elements, what I think was executed well, which I think is most of the game, to be honest, and then some of the stuff that I feel could have been improved. But generally, my thoughts are, like I already said, very, very positive. I definitely think you guys should check the game out. In some ways, it's probably the most return to like the original Resident Evil 1 out of any of the sequels, in some regards even more so than 7 was. And in a lot of ways, I think if you're a fan of that navigation of a small but highly detailed environment, collecting all sorts of different items and figuring out what to do with them, how to traverse a hostile environment that's out to kill you, on very, very limited resources, and using who is probably the most vulnerable protagonist in the whole series, you're definitely going to have a really, really good time with this one. So yeah, with that out of the way, let's just start talking about the game. Or rather, I'm going to talk and you're going to listen to me just kind of like ramble barely coherently for the next 30 minutes or so.
Oh! No! Oh!
So to follow up on what I was just talking about, this is one of the toughest Resident Evil games for me. Resident Evil games are usually at their hardest on the first playthrough because you don't know where anything is, you don't know what's waiting around the corner, what kind of enemy spawns are going to change after you trigger some kind of big narrative event. But this one is a right bastard in many kinds of respects. Grace is the most vulnerable protagonist in all of Resident Evil, mechanically speaking. Yes, even more so than Ethan. In fact, Ethan from 7 looks like Arnold Schwarzenegger from Commando in comparison to her.
Fuck you, asshole.
Fuck you, asshole.
Because Ethan had a couple things Grace would probably kill somebody to have. Ethan had an infinite knife, which if you got really, really good with the knife, you could basically beat the whole game just using the knife. And he also had like the block mechanic, which let him mitigate and even, I believe, completely eliminate damage if you put in some specific items in his inventory to do it. Grace is afforded no such luxuries. She is completely resource dependent. There is a very finite amount of blood that she can collect, that she can use to create knives and ammunition for her two primary weapons. The knives that she can find or make are very, very fragile, and they will break exceptionally quickly. In fact, they will even start to degrade if you just like hit a wall with them. That's how punishing that is. It is very, very easy, even on like the standard / modern difficulty, to mess yourself up severely as Grace and leave yourself off with completely nothing to use to defend yourself with. Effectively soft or even hard locking yourself out of progressing the rest of the game, which is something that Resident Evil doesn't really do outside of like a couple of entries, which are 7 and the very, very first Resident Evil. And while I wouldn't call the Rhodes Hill Care Center as intricately designed or expansive as the Spencer Mansion, it is still an area that loops in on itself, having multiple different floors, rooms, optional areas, and some really, really nasty enemy placements. There were quite a few instances, especially in the East Wing, which is kind of like the surgical operation area of the care center, where I told the game audibly to F off with some of the things that it was expecting me to deal with at any given time. but I think the game has a good balance of that resource-based difficulty, because the reason why a lot of developers shy away from doing things like that, including a lot of Resident Evil developers, is that it is very difficult to just nail the perfect amount. If you give Grace too much stuff, she can still pretty much plow through a lot of the challenges that would have been otherwise legitimately threatened. But if you give her too little, she can come off as very frustrating, too limited in what she can do, and completely gimped, making all of her sections, especially the very first one and the longest one in the care center, to feel like a slog. But I think Requiem, at least on the standard difficulty, manages to have that fine balance. If you play smartly, you can actually eliminate a lot of the enemy challenges to make the backtracking easier for yourself without completely gimping all of your future progress. By the same token, if you avoid conflict, the game gives you legitimate ways to stun enemies, to navigate around them, even use the environment to your advantage to get around them. And I think part of the fun with Grace's gameplay is that with Grace, you really do feel like the threat of the zombies in a way you just can't with Leon anymore. Whenever you play Leon, it's like catharsis mode. Like, it's you going around and taking out all the bastards who've made your life completely miserable as Grace. Just tearing into them, using all sorts of weapons Grace never gets any kind of access to. Beating them up with martial arts moves, your new hatchet weapon. It's not like a full power fantasy with Leon, because if you play stupidly with Leon, the enemies can still mess you up really, really bad. And this is most evident in the Raccoon City portions, where the enemy numbers can get really damn high, and they are just as, if not more, relentless than the ones in the care center. And since I'm already talking about them, I have to say that this game has one of my favorite interpretations of zombies in the franchise. While they are absolutely undead, they still remember what they were and what they were doing at the moment they were turning. And this gives them just enough of leftovers of humanity to make them really scary and creepy, on top of their really messed up designs, because a lot of them have these bleeding eyes, bleeding mouths. A lot of them even have like these kind of like evil grins on their faces. And so when these creepy lunatics rush at you, especially in first-person mode, it is some of the legitimately most tense moments in the series. Hell, even just finding a random corpse on the ground who looks eerily similar to the active enemies out to get you is going to make you nervous, because you don't know if this is just like a poor person who just got messed up really, really bad, or is this an enemy that's going to get up and gonna attack you at certain points. Some of them actually do. Some of them do it in places that you legitimately don't expect them to wake up and attack you at. And these things are incredibly aware about their environment too. These guys aren't just like locked to whatever room they're inside of. If you try and bait them, they can legitimately follow you through the whole care center. If you make noises, some of them will react really violently, and they'll react so violently they'll even attack other zombies nearby, which could potentially make your life easier or make it a living hell, depending on what kind of circumstances you find yourself in. And so it creates this constant tension of, when is it a good time to take these guys out? When is it worth risking the precious ammunition that you have to clear a path? And this is a kind of tension that does inevitably disappear on a repeat playthrough, because on a second playthrough, you're going to remember where a lot of things are, probably not everything, but just enough to plan out a route and decide, okay, I'm going to take them out here because later on I have to do something in this general area, so I'm just going to risk getting a blister head or two to show up later on so that I can have an easier time. But the game can still use that knowledge against you, because if you play on some of the harder difficulties, I've heard, enemy placements and even item placements get reconfigured, so the game might actually use your knowledge that you have from like a previous playthrough against you. That being said, as good as the enemies are in the caretaker center, I'm not a fan of the zombies that are used in Leon's section. Now, I know that it's explained that the connections have been operating without, any kind of control, or rather any outside control in Raccoon City for a while now. They've been running new experiments on the zombies. They've been playing around with this proper post-apocalyptic area that exists in the Resident Evil game canon, and that's one of the reasons why the zombies, who are decades old at this point, are much stronger than their younger variants from Resident Evils 2 and 3. The game does explain this, but it's still really disappointing how completely generic the Raccoon City adversaries generally are. One of the cool things about the Requiem live-action trailer was seeing the mother zombie, the one who is still haunted, whether it knows it or not, by the feelings that she had when she was alive. Visiting her daughter's grave, carrying her daughter's picture in her hand. I feel like they should have played into that more when trying to present the adversaries that Leon faces in Raccoon City, specifically the zombies. Because a lot of them are just generic skeletons, like they could have been taken from literally any video game ever, and in fact, that whole section has gotten some comparisons with The Last of Us.
I'm gonna be a dad. I'm gonna be a dad.
I'm gonna be a dad. I'm gonna be a dad.
With how, the color grading is done, how some of the environments look, even how a lot of the zombies act and sound. But even in The Last of Us, like, the infected still have a lot of personality. These are really messed up people, especially like earlier on in the infection process, who are aware that the cordyceps is messing them up, but they can't do it, and so they're screaming in pain and terror and maybe even like the vain hope that a potential victim that they'll stumble into can stop them or save themselves. And even this like small bit of characterization does not exist with the Raccoon City zombies. And some of them are just kind of like, what were they thinking? Some of these guys have like makeshift spears and hammers in their hands, and they're using these to attack you with. It's like, what are we doing here, guys? And it's a shame because the rest of Raccoon City, I think, is really, really strong. In fact, my favorite bits of Raccoon City are when Raccoon City is quiet, or when Raccoon City is showcasing some of its, like, how do I say it, new ecosystem. Like when Leon stumbles on the big spider nest, like the spiders who did not appear in like the remakes, but they do make an appearance here, like they've made a new ecosystem. Like they have buildings where they live, where they hunt prey, where they cocoon them up and use them for food. That's really cool. This whole idea of that these monsters who just like were like a few examples of them back in the games, now they might like be a proper species in their own right. They have their own like predator and prey relationships with other BOWs who've been living in the shambled ruins of Raccoon City for decades now. That's a great idea. In fact, even Plan 43 showing up as it has burrowed underneath the city. It's taken root in like the city's exposed underground. The packs of dogs who have mutated so much that they kind of resemble the mutant dogs from Resident Evil 4 remake. All that kind of stuff where it looks like the various BOWs have created like a new isolated way of life all of their own are some of my favorite bits of the Raccoon City chapters. On top of the aforementioned ones where it's just you going through Kendo's shop, going through the RPD building, having that one zombie encounter that I really like where Leon is like just going through the halls and he just says, Jesus Christ, and he finds a shambler, decades old, still wearing the old RPD uniform. And Leon puts him down without any kind of issue. And he gives him like a somber little eulogy by telling him, it's okay, officer, you can finally rest now. These are the kinds of things in the Raccoon City chapters that really struck a chord with me. And I feel like if the game leaned into more of the whole idea of Raccoon City became its own like almost like BOW playground, where a lot of these things have been allowed to just kind of like evolve and grow in their own little environment decades later on, I think would have given it much more personality. That being said, I don't agree with people who say that like the Leon portion is like a massive cliff drop off in quality. That's just nonsense. Because the core gameplay loop with Leon is still as good as it's ever been. It's not a massive evolution of what he was able to do in the remake of Resident Evil 4. It's more like a side grade where he feels a little bit tighter to control. There's less of that like animation involved awkwardness which could sometimes mess you up in the earlier RE Engine titles. The hatchet is a fine addition, I guess, but it's not really that mechanically different from the knife. I personally would have allowed Leon the ability to throw the hatchet, similar to how the Ganados do it. Like the player can do it as well as a free projectile attack, but one that could incur a special cost. Like maybe if Leon parries the axe, it can never fully break and it can always be fixed. But if Leon throws the axe when it's at low durability, he might be able to score a critical hit or stun an enemy, but then the axe legitimately breaks and he has to buy a new one, or he has to repair the existing one, but at a far, far, far steeper cost than it would have been to just repair a regular axe. Something like that I think could have added a little bit more depth to the hatchet itself. But like I said, playing as Leon is a massive catharsis factor. In fact, when you see how easily Leon dispatches a bunch of old bad guys who are these massive threats in the old games, and he takes them out in 90 seconds, it just shows you that the developers were right to say that Leon and the old crew are too good at this stuff now. You cannot make a survival horror game with these guys anymore. They're just too experienced. And since I'm on the subject of Leon, I have to really say that I finally understand why people like the new interpretation of Leon. One of my big criticisms with a lot of the protagonists of the remake era games is the fact that a lot of their charm and likability has been replaced with angst, but it's very surface level angst. It's never really delved deep enough into their psyches to make me care about what these guys are angsting about. That was one of my big critiques of Resident Evil 4 Remake. Leon is really broken up about the fact that he could not save anyone in Raccoon City, even though he saved Claire and Sherry. He keeps acting like he failed absolutely everyone, and I get it. Guilt is not a rational feeling to have, and this game very much explores the irrationalities of guilt, how far guilt can take people in positive and negative directions. But in this game, having Leon, who is at death's door throughout the entire experience, having to go back to Raccoon City, having to clean up the last leftovers of Umbrella and these various different antagonists who've either plagued him or some of his closest friends all their lives at this point, it finally clicked with me. I finally get what they're going for with this Leon. They finally executed the whole guilt angle with Leon in a way that I find him a compelling character again. And I think it works because we have Grace Ashcroft as the secondary protagonist. See, Leon is a man who always feels like he's too late to make a difference. That's the core of his guilt. Leon did not show up on time for his new job, and by the time he arrived there, almost all of his colleagues were dead, wiped out. The city that he was supposed to help protect is gone, beyond repair, beyond saving, and Leon was late to all of it. He wasn't there. He could have been an officer who made a difference. He maybe could have saved one person, 2 people, 10 people. Maybe if he was there, Marvin wouldn't have gotten bit. Maybe if he was there, Chief Irons could have been stopped. Or maybe if he was there, he would have been, killed immediately by a horde of zombies and accomplished completely nothing. But it's not the point that Leon knows that he objectively could have done something. It's the possibility, the whole guilt that I mentioned before, that eats away at him. It's the fact that he never got a chance to be there and to even try and make a difference that has gnawed at him for almost 30 years now. And like I said, guilt is not a rational feeling a lot of the time. In fact, guilt has often been described as an emotion where people blame themselves for things that they could not control at any possible way as a way to assert some control over those situations. If you blame yourself about something that was outside your control, you're trying to get some control. You're trying to tell yourself that you could have done something, that you could have made some kind of big difference, even if, when you put everything out on the cards, Leon really couldn't have done much. In fact, statistically, it is highly improbable Leon would have made any kind of difference. But it isn't really until the end of this game where he finally is able to lay a lot of the things that have been gnawing at him to rest that Leon finally feels like he can relax. In fact, he even says that he feels better than he ever has, or at least in a very, very long time. And to go back to my original point at the start of this ramble, there's Grace Ashcroft. If Leon is a man who is always guilty because he feels like he's always late or not present enough to avoid disaster, Grace Ashcroft is a character who thinks that her very existence brings nothing but death and misfortune to everybody. And in a stark contrast to Leon, she's unfortunately kinda true a lot of the time. Because Spencer chose her to be kind of like his hope spot, his chance of redemption after the mess that happened in Raccoon City, Grace and everyone associated with her get targeted by the remnants of Umbrella, by the connections. Her adoptive mother, Alyssa Ashcroft, constantly had to move herself and Grace from town to town so that interested parties couldn't track them down, which left Grace friendless, very, very socially awkward. It probably also meant that her mom very rarely, if ever, got a decent night's sleep after adopting her. That she always had to check over her shoulder, always had to be afraid or worried if someone was out to get her. If like, oh, I bumped into a stranger on the street. Was he really a stranger, or is he like a super secret ex-Umbrella agent out to get me and my daughter? That's like a lot of pressure for anybody to live with for years and years of time. And it is solely because of Grace's existence, not because of anything she consciously did, but just because she's there. And then Alyssa is murdered to get to Grace. And as the game progresses, you realize that not only did Alyssa Ashcroft get killed to get to Grace, but a lot of other innocent people do. Like the mini outbreak in Renwood happens because Victor got his hands on Grace, Leon's hot on his heels, and so he has to make a little outbreak to throw Leon off. The outbreak in the Rhodes Care Center once again happens because Gideon decides, oh no, Leon's hot on my heels. Well, time to cause a little outbreak, so he, fights zombies for a few hours while I get Grace and myself out of here.
What he said. What he said.
So once again, a lot of people die, not because of something Grace necessarily did, but just because she exists and people want her. And this continues as kind of like a tragic through line for her character throughout the whole game. Grace constantly feels responsible for basically, she feels guilty for being alive. And that's a really messed up emotion to have. And it's made even worse by the fact that she's not completely wrong. And by the end of the game, she really feels like a very sympathetic character. I was very skeptical if I was going to like Grace. The whole panic attack, anxious protagonist thing. It came off to me from like previews as pandering to like newer audiences who are always anxious about everything and nothing. And I'm just not a fan of characters like that, even going past what I just said. But when you see the things Grace is anxious about, the kind of life that she's had to live, it's virtually impossible not to get to either one of the endings of the game and not feel bad for her. And I think one of the reasons why the two endings really work for me, regardless if you get like the good ending or the bad one, is that both endings feel kind of like logical conclusions, but on opposite sides of like the spectrum. Because in the bad ending, Leon, he fails to save Sherry. He fails to save the other people infected with the Raccoon City syndrome. He knows he's gonna die. He knows Zeno is like seconds away from blowing his brains out, which he does. But Leon consoles himself with the fact that, hey, at least before I died, I was able to save one more person. I was able to get Grace Ashcroft out of this mess alive, even if it kills me. Whereas with Grace's side, it's like she kind of fails everybody. Like, not only has like her adoptive mother got killed because of her, without Elpis, Emily's going to die. A lot of like the characters that we know throughout the Resident Evil franchise are also going to die from Raccoon City syndrome. The connections haven't been stopped. All the BOW stuff that's been unleashed is going to continue wreaking havoc across the world. And even like Spencer's final shot at redemption got completely messed up by the one person he was banking on that hope being realized by. And so in that ending, it's like Grace's failure is complete. She has failed everybody who was even like a little bit emotionally invested in her or anyone she was invested in. And she's just gonna have to live with that for the rest of her life. It's a really tragic angle for both characters to take, but one, like I said, feels like in a kind of different series, in a series with more of a somber, kind of downbeat tone. These endings make a lot of logical sense for the way these two characters have been framed throughout this game or throughout multiple games in the case of Leon Kennedy. But then when you get to like the good ending, it's like Grace has succeeded, like the hope that was placed in her by Spencer, by Alyssa, paid off. She has played a pivotal role in completely throwing out the whole bioweapons nonsense war that's been going on in the Resident Evil series for decades by this point. She gets a new family with Emily. She has succeeded at something. She's managed to save somebody. She's proven that her existence wasn't a mistake, that she has managed to do great good in the world. And same thing with Leon. Leon is finally able to let go of the guilt at least a little bit. And not only is he physically cured of the virus that started with that fateful night in Raccoon City, but he has put down all of these bastards to rest. He's putting down the remnants of Umbrella, Tricell, the Connections. He is taking all of these guys out in one fell swoop. And by the end of the game, when he tells Sherry, man, I feel like $1 million. I haven't felt this good in ages. You can hear it. You can see it in his voice. You can really feel like this is a man who has finally put down some of his own demons, laid them to rest, and he can actually move on a little bit with his life. And on that subject, I have to say, it is incredibly impressive that this game is able to bring in so many disparate elements and plot threads from the convoluted mess that is the Resident Evil series. Let's be honest, the organization of this series is a complete madhouse. Not only is this series notorious for good reason, for setting things up and then never paying them off, or like introducing like new villainous organizations that get taken out off screen, or just get sidelined for like 10, 15 years only to show back up again. And this game takes so many elements from all those disparate hanging plot threads, and it makes a proper conclusion out of them. A lot of like the old bad guys come back in one shape or form. Events from Resident Evil 6, the biggest piece of nonsense that Resident Evil has ever made, gets recontextualized here in a way that makes that game retroactively way, way better in my opinion. Because they revealed that not only did Simmons kill the president to stop him from revealing, we nuked Raccoon City because there was a big zombie apocalypse, and we were funding Umbrella in the development of, the outbreak that led to the destruction of the city. But there's another layer to it, because the president in RE6 was going to reveal that the Connections pulled the U.S. Army's strings and used it to cover up this secret laboratory that was being hidden underneath the city so that they could, discover Elpis and Spencer's next supposed bioweapon masterpiece. That's a great reveal that makes a lot of what happens in 6 retroactively much, much better. It doesn't save the horrendous structure of that game and the nonsense priorities the developers had for it, but it makes this one event in Resident Evil 6 retroactively much more interesting. And that's just one example I can name off the top of my head. There's things from like Resident Evil 3 that get brought in here, Resident Evil 0 even. Umbrella Chronicles, the last game before, I believe, like the RE Engine era began, and the most who gives a damn entry in the entire series gets not only overtly referenced here, but actually some of like the nastiest enemies in the whole game come from the Umbrella Corps. And one of the main antagonists of the game was directly set up, at least retroactively, via a multiplayer game that nobody freaking played. And I don't get the sense that this is just there for fan service. Like, obviously, seeing like an old Leon Kennedy traverse the streets of Raccoon City and see the RPD again, there's a lot of fan service potential there. But out of all of the various franchises who have absolutely choked to death on their obsession with callbacks and nostalgia, and using it as a replacement for literally anything interesting, Resident Evil, of all of them manages to bring back a lot of its own messy continuity to the forefront again and give it a lot of, I think, legitimately great payoffs. Rey Skywalker wishes she was as 10th of a good character, narratively and thematically, as Grace Ashcroft is. Let that sink in. I never thought I'd say that. I really did not think that the story of a Resident Evil game would impress me this way. But it really does feel like everyone said, let's lock in, let's make this a proper Requiem to all of the stuff from like the original set of games and even some of the later ones from like the 7th gen era. And let's conclude that in a way that is legitimately super satisfying. Unless you're an obnoxious shipper person who's obsessed with who's Leon banging, which, let's be honest, like those people are never going to be happy. Like, you can reveal anything about who Leon is supposedly married to, and those people will lose their minds about it. But let's not end that video on a bad turn. This game rocks. In fact, I like this game the more I talk about it, the more I think about it. It's right up there with one of the best Resident Evils, in my opinion, and it's definitely the second best one still of the RE Engine era. It's not as consistently good as 4-make was, for the reasons that I specified beforehand, but when it's doing things well, it's doing things even better than that game was, at least in some narrative choices. And I'm really excited to see what they're going to do now. They have closed the door on a lot of old plot threads, but they're also clearly willing to expand on plot threads that they set up back in Resident Evil Village with the whole BSAA subplot. That looks like that's going to be the driving force, at least for the next game. Maybe we're finally going to get some answers about who does Ada Wong work for? What is this rival organization that she's apparently been an operative of all the way from like 1998, but they've stayed like nameless and in the shadows this whole time. Maybe now that the remnants of Umbrella, the connections, and all of these other established antagonists are gone, they're going to be the next set of bad guys for at least the next game or the next series of games. They have a really good opportunity here to give some consistency back to the series. Set up plot points, conclude them, and if the writing stays as strong as it's been here in Requiem, then we're going to be eating very, very good, my friends.
Good soup.
So yeah, Requiem, check it out. It's a great time. If you've already played it, I hope you had as much of a good time with it as I did. And I'm very interested to see what next games we're going to be getting. My guess is probably that Code Veronica remake. I know that they're supposedly working on that, a Resident Evil 0 remake, and a Resident Evil 5 remake. If I was a betting man, I would probably say that Code Veronica and 5 are the likeliest candidates because you can make a very good through line in those games with like the whole Chris versus Wesker storyline. And they've already clearly retconned what Spencer's like personality was after the Raccoon City incident. So like his original characterization in 5 is kinda not working anymore. So I think that if they're using like Requiem to tease what Spencer's personality is going to be in an eventual remake of 5, good on them. I'm excited for that. I think 5 is another solid entry that with better direction could turn out really well. But we'll see. When it happens, I'll be talking about it to be sure, and I'll hopefully see you guys for that eventual video down the line.